He had no idea that the small, beat-up lockbox sitting in the back of my son's closet would be the thing that ended him. I want to start there because everything else, all the patience, all the quiet watching, all the nights I sat at my kitchen table writing in a notebook nobody knew existed. It only makes sense if you understand that I saw this coming long before my son did. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a land surveyor in rural Ohio, and I know how to read people the same way I learned to read land. Slowly, carefully, and without letting what I want to see get in the way of what's actually there. My son's name is Archer. He's 34 now. Back when this started, he was 31, working as a shift supervisor at a logistics company outside Columbus, living in the same apartment he'd had since he was 26. Quiet kid, reliable. The kind of man who called his mother every Sunday even after she passed. That tells you something about a person. He met his wife at a birthday party for a mutual friend. Her name was Celeste. She was 28, sharp-looking. The kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately assessed who in it was worth talking to. I noticed that the first time Archer brought her to my house for dinner, she scanned the living room the way you'd scan a menu. Not because she was curious, but because she was pricing things. I didn't say anything. I smiled and passed the green beans and asked her about herself, which is what you do when you're trying to understand someone rather than judge them. She told me she worked in marketing. She told me she grew up in Pittsburgh. She told me Archer was the most genuine man she'd ever met, and she looked at him when she said it in a way that could have been love but felt more like appraisal. I filed that away. They got engaged 8 months after they met. Archer called me from the parking lot of the jewelry store, voice cracking a little, saying, "Dad, I did it." I told him I was proud of him, and I was, genuinely. I just wasn't sure yet what I was proud of him walking into. The first thing I noticed, the very first, was the way she talked about my house. I own a piece of property about 40 minutes outside of Columbus. The house itself isn't much to look at. 3 bedrooms, needs a new roof on the addition. The kitchen hasn't been updated since 1987, but the land it sits on is 11 acres. And that land has been in my family since my grandfather bought it in 1951. It backs up to a creek. There are 2 outbuildings, one of which I've used as a workshop for 20 years. The second time Celeste came to visit, she stood on the back porch looking out at the property and said, "You know, you could subdivide this and make a real killing." Just like that. Not a question, not a suggestion, exactly. More like she was thinking out loud about something she'd already decided. I said, "I know," and I left it there. But I started paying closer attention after that. Over the next several months, this was before the wedding, I noticed small things, the way she'd ask Archer, casually, how much I paid for the property, the way she'd mention in passing what land was selling for in that county. She asked once whether I had a will, framed it as concern, said she just wanted to make sure everything was organized. Archer didn't think anything of it. He trusts people. That's not a flaw exactly. It just makes him easier to steer. I also noticed the way she handled money between the 2 of them. Archer was paying for most things, the apartment, the groceries, the vacations she started planning shortly after they got together. She was working, she told him, but she had expenses from before. Student loans, she said, a car payment, some debt she was embarrassed about. Archer never pushed. He just covered more. I had a conversation with him about it. Gentle, about 6 months before the wedding. I said, "Son, have you 2 talked about finances?" He said they had. He said she was getting on her feet and he was happy to help her through it. He said it like he was defending her, so I backed off. You can only pull a rope so hard before the person on the other end just digs in. The wedding was in September. Small ceremony, about 60 people, held at a barn venue about 20 miles from my place. Celeste wore a dress that cost, I later found out, more than Archer's monthly rent. Her parents came from Pittsburgh. Quiet, pleasant people who seemed as uncertain about their daughter as I was. Her father shook my hand at the reception and said, "Your son's a good man." The way he said it, with a kind of relief, told me he'd been hoping she'd end up with someone like Archer. The first year of the marriage was fine, from what I could see. Archer seemed happy. They visited a few times. Celeste was pleasant enough with me, though our conversations never went very deep. She'd ask about the property sometimes, just briefly, how the acreage was assessed, whether I'd looked into any development options, whether I'd thought about downsizing. I always answered the same way. Oh, I'm in no rush. Smile. Change the subject. What I didn't tell her, what I hadn't told Archer either, not in any real detail, was that the property had appreciated considerably. A developer had approached me twice in the past few years about a section of the acreage. There was also a natural gas rights issue that a lawyer had helped me resolve in my favor about a decade ago, which generated more income than I generally talked about. I kept my finances quiet. Always had. My wife used to say I was private to the point of stubbornness. She wasn't wrong. The second year at the marriage is when things started to shift. Archer called me one evening in February, later than he usually called. He sounded tired in a way that wasn't physical. He said Celeste had been stressed. He said she wanted them to move into a bigger place, and he wasn't sure they could afford it. He said she'd been bringing up the property more, my property, and wondering whether I'd ever considered doing something with it. I asked him what he thought about that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think she's got big ideas about things that aren't mine to give her. That was the most clearly I'd ever heard my son see his wife. I remember I stood up from my kitchen chair when he said it, just stood up without realizing it. I said, That's right, Archer. They're not yours to give. And then I said, How are you doing? Not the house stuff. You. He said he was okay, but the pause before he said it was long enough that I knew he wasn't. After that call, I started keeping notes. Not a diary exactly. Just a small spiral notebook I kept in the drawer under my nightstand. Dates, conversations, things I observed. If Archer mentioned something Celeste had said or done, I wrote it down. If I noticed something myself during a visit, I wrote it down. I know that sounds calculated. Maybe it was. But I'd watched my brother lose half his retirement to a divorce proceeding where nothing had been documented, where it was his word against his ex-wife's attorney, and I swore I'd never let that happen to anyone in my family again. I also, quietly, made an appointment with my own attorney. I updated my will. I clarified the property situation in writing. I made sure that what was mine was clearly, legally, unambiguously mine, and that any path someone might try to take to get at it was blocked before they thought to try it. And I got the lockbox. It's a small thing, fireproof, about the size of a shoebox, with a combination I set myself. I put copies of important documents in it, the deed, the gas rights paperwork, the updated will, a letter from my attorney outlining the property's current status and value. I put photographs in it too, the property in different seasons, the outbuildings, the acreage markers, and I put the notebook in it once it was full and started a new one. I kept the lockbox at the back of the closet in my spare bedroom, the same spare bedroom where Archer used to sleep when he visited as a kid, after he'd grown up and moved out, when he'd come back for holidays and stay a few nights. I didn't hide it from him exactly. I just never mentioned it. I want to be honest here. I hoped I was wrong about Celeste. I genuinely did. There's no satisfaction watching a marriage go the way I suspected this one was going. Archer is my only son. His mother passed when he was 22. It was always just the two of us after that, and I wanted nothing more than to be wrong about the woman he'd chosen, but I wasn't. The third year of the marriage, Archer's calls started coming more frequently, and later in the evening, he'd started drinking more than he used to. I noticed it during visits, and he admitted it once without quite saying it directly, the way men of his generation do. He said he'd been unwinding more at the end of the day. He said the apartment felt tense. He said Celeste had started talking about my property, not as a hypothetical, but as a plan. She'd apparently been researching what it would take to transfer property to a family member for tax purposes, and she'd mentioned it to Archer in a way that suggested she'd already done quite a bit of thinking about it. He called me on a Thursday in March. It was late, past 10, and he said, Dad, I need to tell you something and I don't want you to get upset. That's how he starts things he thinks will upset me. He said Celeste had gone to see a real estate attorney, on her own. without telling him until after. She'd apparently had a consultation about what it would mean for the property if I were to gift it to Archer, and what Archer's rights to it would be in the event of, as she put it to the attorney, a change in circumstances, meaning divorce. She'd been quietly researching what she could claim. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked Archer how he felt about it. He said, "I feel like I don't know who I married." I told him to come stay with me for a few days. He said he couldn't. He said things were complicated right now and he needed to figure some things out on his own. I understood that. A man has to find his own way to a door before he'll walk through it. I just made sure the door was there. That weekend, I drove to Columbus. I didn't call ahead. I told Archer I was coming through on other business, which was partly true. I had an errand on that side of the city, and I stopped by their apartment on a Sunday afternoon. Celeste was home. Archer was out getting groceries. She was pleasant, offered me coffee, sat down at the kitchen table across from me, and then, because she could tell I wasn't there to make small talk, she got to it. She said she thought it would be good for all of us if I considered the family's future. She said property like mine shouldn't just sit there. She said, and I remember this clearly, that she'd done her research, and she knew what the land was worth, and she thought it was only fair that Archer have access to what was rightfully going to be his anyway. I let her finish. Then I said, very calmly, "Celeste, that land belongs to me, not Archer, not the family, me, and what happens to it is my decision, made in my own time." She looked at me for a moment. Then she smiled the way people smile when they've decided to try a different approach. And she said, "Of course, I just want what's best for everyone." I drove home that afternoon and wrote down everything she'd said, word for word as best I could remember it. 2 months later, Archer called me and said he and Celeste were separating. She'd moved out. He sounded wrecked, but also, underneath that, like a man who'd finally put down something very heavy. I didn't celebrate. I just said I was sorry, that I loved him, and that he could come stay with me as long as he needed. He came the following weekend and stayed for 3 weeks. What happened next, I didn't expect. Though looking back, I probably should have. About 6 weeks after the separation, I got a call from my neighbor, a retired man named Lou, who lives about a quarter mile down the road and keeps an eye on things when I'm in town running errands. He called on a Tuesday afternoon, and when I answered, I could tell right away something was wrong. He said, "There's a car parked at the end of your lane. Been there about 40 minutes, woman in it just sitting there." I asked him what kind of car. He described it. It was Celeste's. Then he said, "She got out about 10 minutes ago and walked up towards your outbuildings. I didn't know if I should call you or not." I told him he'd done exactly the right thing. I told him to stay where he was and I'd be there in 20 minutes. I wasn't in town. I was 45 minutes away at my attorney's office, where I'd been that morning going over some updated paperwork, which is its own kind of coincidence that I still think about. I called Archer on the way. He didn't answer. I called Lou back and asked him to go stand at the end of my lane, visible, just so she knew someone was watching. He's 71 years old and mostly deaf in one ear, but he's not a man who backs down, and I knew he'd do it. By the time I got to the property, Celeste was back in her car. She'd been at the outbuilding. I could see the marks in the gravel. Saw that she'd tried the door handle, which is padlocked from the outside, with a heavy lock I installed years ago because the door doesn't latch right otherwise. She hadn't gotten in. She couldn't have. But she'd tried. I pulled up, got out of my truck, and walked over to her car. She rolled down the window. She looked startled but recovered quickly and said she'd just been in the neighborhood and wanted to pick up a few things she'd left at my house during previous visits. I said, "You've never left anything at my house, Celeste." She didn't say anything to that. I said, "I want you to know that everything on this property is documented. The land, the structures, what's inside them, what's not inside them. I have a neighbor who saw you arrive and saw where you went. And I have an attorney whose number I strongly suggest you pass along to yours, because that's how any future communication about this property needs to happen." She rolled up the window and drove away. I stood in the gravel for a minute before going inside. Then I went to the spare bedroom, opened the closet, pulled out the lockbox, sat down on the edge of the bed, and opened it. Everything was there. The deed, the will, the notebooks, both of them with dates and conversations going back almost 2 full years. The photographs, the attorney letters, the gas rights documentation, all of it exactly where I'd put it, all of it exactly as I'd kept it. I sat there for a while. I thought about my son, who was back in Columbus trying to figure out how to start over. I thought about my wife, who would have handled all of this with a lot more grace than I did. I thought about the property, the 11 acres, the creek, the outbuildings, the workshop full of tools that accumulated over a lifetime, and what it had meant to my grandfather to buy it in 1951 with money he'd saved for 12 years. None of this was about money. I want to be clear about that. I have enough. I've always had enough. This was about something Celeste never understood, which is that some things aren't for sale and some people aren't for leverage. And learning that lesson, really learning it, sometimes costs more than you were planning to spend. Archer finalized his divorce 8 months later. Celeste's attorney had made a run at the property in the settlement, framing it as a marital expectation based on conversations she claimed Archer had had with her about his inheritance. My attorney handled it. The documentation I'd been keeping made it straightforward to establish that I had made no promises, that the property had always been clearly mine, and that there was a documented pattern of her attempting to access my land without permission or invitation. It was over quickly after that, faster than I expected. Archer came out to the property the weekend after the divorce was finalized. We did what we usually do, walked the perimeter, checked the fence line, stood at the edge of the creek for a while without saying much. He's a quiet person. Always has been. At some point he said, "Did you know, Dad, before any of this happened?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, "I didn't know, but I paid attention. And when you pay attention long enough, you start to see the shape of things." He nodded. Then he said, "The lockbox. You had everything in there?" I said, "I did." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I said, "Because I was hoping I'd never need it." That was the truth. Every bit of it. We walked back to the house through the tall grass at the edge of the property, my son and I thought about all the things a man accumulates over 63 years, the land, the documents, the quiet records of the things he's witnessed, and how most of it is worthless unless someone's paying attention. I'd been paying attention. That was all. Sometimes that's enough.